There we go. I think I kind of lost track of what the current time was. So I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late. The stream should be live now. So the overview of what I want to go over today is to talk about kind of given the hands-on 4 project with the NPR tech news stories. The plan is to talk about how can we use these components, these architecture components, to simplify a program like that. If you've read through, if we kind of look through the slides for 10.1, if you've gone through the labs for 10.1, all of that will talk about how to use a database to store your data. But it doesn't really go over a lot in terms of, well, what happens if your data is really coming from the network? So that's what I want to focus on today, is talk about those tools. And there's a few tools along the way that we'll cover that maybe were briefly mentioned in the concept chapter, including a class called mutable livedata. And there's also a class called mediator livedata. Both of those we're going to need, but those weren't really touched in the theory, at least up to this point. So I want to show you how those are useful, especially when we're dealing with data that might be coming from the network, using kind of Volley as our backend. Okay. So that's kind of the overview. The first thing we're going to do with this project is add a repository and move a lot of the code that's currently spread between main activity and the service, the job service, and move that into one place, into the repository, so it can manage the data or manage the current version of the data, the current view of the data. And then we'll look at, once we've got it into the repository, how can we maybe cache some of that data for offline viewing. So caching at least one part in shared preference, as well as we'll look at caching data, namely the articles, into a database. So that's where we're headed. Any questions? Any difficulties with going through Lab 10.1b? I think, I might have already posted it, but maybe I didn't. I can do that real quick. Let me close Android Studio so it doesn't interact while I'm doing that. And in here I want to clean, so I clean up the extra files first. Okay, clean up the extra files, zip that up. And I'm going to toss that in here. Okay, that's up on Discord now. Okay. When you've got that, when you're ready to go with the Hands-On Test 4 project, just go ahead and post something in the YouTube chat, and then we'll get going when everybody's ready. Okay, just waiting on Ben if you're here. Okay, cool. So before I get going, I mentioned at the end of this, end of yesterday, that it's probably worth kind of grouping your different files into different folders rather than having them all in one place, especially as things get larger. So I want to do a quick reorganization on this before I start to add the repository, just to kind of keep it cleaner. So in order to do that, I'm going to go first to this little gear, and I'm going to hit uncheck compact middle packages. The reason I'm going to do that is because it tends to hide packages that are empty, which may cause a problem as you're trying to move things around and create those packages. So you want to uncheck compact middle packages. Also, if you're running a different version of Android Studio, you may find that as you create packages, your steps are going to be a little bit different. If you're using a newer version of Android Studio, when you right-click and create a package, it will already have kind of the path to what you right-clicked on. You'll definitely want to keep that. So where I'm going to start on this hands-on test 4 folder, this package. I'm going to right-click that, and I'm going to create two new packages. So the first one I'm going to call data, which is where I'm going to store all my back-end code. And the next one I'm going to call UI, which is where I'm going to store all my front-end code. Okay. Now within the UI, I've got a few different folders. New package. We're going to create a activity package underneath the UI folder. And I also want to create an adapter package in there as well. So that's all I need on the UI side. On the data side, I am going to create, actually I don't really need to create anything more on that front. So going into the adapter will be the article list adapter class. Do refactor, yep. And going into the activity class will be main activity. Okay. Now, there's a few things that you'll notice if you're looking around as to how that's changed things. So for instance, if I look in the manifest, rather than this being just .main activity, this is now .ui, .activity, .main activity. And that's because I've moved it into this UI activity folder. So just be forewarned that that is going to happen as we move these things around. It also will mean if you're kind of using a class that's in a different package, you may see that you have an import for those other classes now as well. So for instance, you can see in main activity, I now have an import for article, tech news app, article list adapter, all of those because they're now in another package. As long as any classes are in the same package as what your class is, you automatically get those imported. So you don't have to import those, but as you start moving things around, you'll see additional imports start showing up, or you'll just need additional imports. So these three classes, article news, tech news app, all three of those I'm going to move into the data folder. Yep, do refactor, data, refactor, tech news service, refactor. Okay, so those three I've moved into my data folder. Okay, so those are kind of my back-end code. The article class, the app class, and the service class. Okay, so that's my folder structure there. So now under data, I'm going to create a new class. We're going to call this the Tech News Repository. Okay, so my goal is I want to move basically all the code that deals with managing the data into here. Okay, so I want to expose the relevant data to the UI through live data objects. So that's really going to be two pieces. It's going to be the description of the feed as well as the articles or the items. So those are the only two live data objects I'm really exposing from the repository. Now, I haven't added the dependencies for live data yet, so I do need to add those in here. Okay, so I'm going to go to my Gradle, and we're going to add dependencies for our live data class. Actually, I might be able to just add that directly here, and it may just fill it in. So if I start with, say, private, I'll want a mutable live data here. Mutable live data that is a string. This is going to be feed description. And it looks like it's actually gone ahead and included that there. And did that go ahead and add the appropriate dependency or not? Tech News Repository. I don't see any new dependency, so I'm not sure how that pulled it in. All right. I may just come back to that. So we added mutable live data, private mutable live data. So this is also going to be here for a list of articles. And this is going to be articles. Okay. Now, live data gives me a way to observe it, and that's what we use with the room database. That's what it provides. So it gives you a way to observe that data, observe the data in the table. It doesn't give you a way to directly change it, because remember, we need any insert, update, deletes that we do with the database we need to do actually through the relevant methods. Now, mutable live data gives us a way to actually change the data that's inside of there. So that's for, here we're going to get the data from Volley and then kind of stuff it into those live data objects. So this is what I'm going to end up exposing to the user. And that's why I'm using mutable live data, is because I want to be able to change it. I'm going to be able to retrieve that data from Volley. Okay, so let's add a few more. So that's the data I want to expose. I'm going to add a few more things in here because I know I'll need them. So in here, I'm going to add a Volley request queue. Request queue. And I also know I'll need a reference to the application. So Tech News app, app. So let's start with those instance variables. Okay. I do need a constructor for the Tech News repository, so I'm going to add that in here. Public Tech News repository. The only thing I need to construct my repository is the application object. So I'm going to pass that in as a constructor argument. Okay, and that's going to let me set up everything else that I need to set up. So let's save that application object first. I need to get a request queue. So I'm going to do request queue dot. Sorry, am I missing the wrong thing? Oh no, Volley. Volley request queue. Volley dot new request queue. Pass in the app. Because remember, an application object is also a context, so I can use that here to build up that request queue. Okay, so that's those first two pieces, and then I'm just going to create the mutable live data that I need. So feeddescription is equal to new mutable live data. You'll notice, just a reminder, I don't have to specify the type here because Java will automatically infer that type. And articles is equal to new mutable live data. Okay. So that's my basic constructor started. I do need to add in two getters to get the live data objects. Now, it is important when I expose them through the getters, I want to make sure I expose them as live data and not as mutable live data. Okay, so the reason we're going to use the mutable live data here is because I need to access the set value or the post value methods to change the data that's there. Okay. Which we'll get to in a minute. That'll be when I create the method to like fetch the list of articles. So here I want to expose those as live data objects. So get feed description, no m. I'm just going to say return and feed description, and that automatically will automatically upcast it from a mutable live data object to a live data object, because a mutable is a subclass of the live data class. So that's good. Same thing with the articles. So I need a method to get that live data. So live data list of articles. Okay, and I'm going to call this method get articles. So basically that's the interface that the rest of the app is then going to use to actually access and work with the data. It's going to be through both of those live data objects. Okay. So the next piece is to start building the logic to actually fetch the data and put it into those live data objects. So in here, I'm going to add a new method, public void refresh articles. Okay, so in there I want to make a volley request to go get the articles. Now I do remember that I'll need the URL of the feed to accomplish that. So if I go over to Tech News app, I can grab that from here. Public static final, bring over that feed URL. I'm going to add that in as a constant up here. I'm actually going to change that to be private because I'm going to end up switching everything over so that the rest of the code doesn't need to know anything about that URL. So this repository will end up being the only class that needs to know about that URL, rather than it being in 2 or 3 different places. So in here, I'm going to make a new request. So mRequestQueue dot add new. Well, what kind of request do I need to send out? Well, I know if I kind of look back at my previous code, I know that I'm going to need a JSON object back. That's what I'm going to be expecting. So I'm going to make a new JSON object request. And inside there, I need to give it the method. So request dot, nope, I want the volley request object. Request dot method dot get. Okay, so the method is get, and the URL is the feed URL constant. And then the next thing I need is null, because I'm not going to send any data to the server. and I then need to add my listeners. So new response listener. Okay, so that's going to listen to the data when it comes back, and a new error listener for when there are errors. Okay, so that's the basic structure. Here I want to, if something goes wrong, I want to show the error on the UI somehow. And here I want to process the results. So as I process the results, that's where I'm going to end up changing the values of feed description and changing the value of articles. Okay, so that data is going to be pulled from the response. Okay, so I have a few options of how I can implement the processing of the results. I could write all of that code here for the most part, with the exception of a few things that potentially need to run on the background thread. Specifically when I deal with caching the data in room, that will need to be on the background thread. But some of the things can run on the foreground thread. One of the things to know about volley, I'm sure I mentioned this at some point, maybe I didn't. Volley will go ahead and run or issue the request on the background thread, on a background thread. That deals with all the network calls and such, and just turning it into a JSON object. But once it calls on response, or once it calls on error response, both of these methods here, on response, on error response, both of those methods are actually called back on the main thread, which is okay if you're using volley from an activity. That's usually kind of what you want. But it's not what I want really from a repository sense. So I'd rather have all of the code that happens here in onResponse, I'd rather have that happen on a background thread. Okay. So I have a few ways I could do that. I could spin up an async task to do that, and that would be perfectly fine. However, async tasks do have some execution limits in the sense that some versions of Android, you can't run more than one async task at the same time, as well as there's just some additional overhead with the async task that I don't really need here. So rather than spinning up an async task, which is kind of a wrapper around a thread, I'm actually just going to use a raw thread to process these results, okay? Which is kind of a new thing. We've talked about threading. I talked about threading when we talked about background threads, but we didn't really end up using them. All the stuff we've done so far, we've done directly. We've done just kind of using that async task helper. But here I actually want to use just straight up a thread. And that's actually might seem a little bit intimidating, but it's actually going to be pretty easy. So in here, I'm going to create a new class. Private class process articles thread. Now, this is not the only way to spin up a thread. You don't necessarily have to create a thread subclass to create a secondary or a background thread. Really, all that's required is to implement the runnable interface. So you could do that as well. Here, I'm just going to implement the thread class itself. Because this should be simple enough for what I'm trying to do. So we're going to make a subclass of thread. And basically the way that works is once I start the thread, it's going to call the run method. So the run method's kind of going to be our do in background. Okay, so if I do a quick check here, public, I'm going to do run. So we'll override the run method. In here, maybe I want to do some logging. So let's go up here. Let's say to create a quick constant for a log tag, private static final string log tag is equal to tech news repository dot class dot get simple name. So that's our tag. I'm going to use that for all the logging that I'm going to do in here, which, because all this stuff is running in the background, logging is really helpful for seeing what's going on. So here I'm going to just add a simple logging statement to say log.I log tag or processing articles. Okay. I don't need to call the superclass version of run. The superclass, that superclass run always just does nothing. So I don't really need to call it in this case. So I'm going to say when that thread runs, we just simply log. That way I can kind of start to see this working. So going back up here, we're going to say when that runs, let's just go ahead and fire up a new thread. So I'm going to say new process articles thread, and then we're going to call start on that. Okay. So we call start to tell it to run it. You don't actually call run directly when you're creating a thread. Similarly to how when you're spinning up an async task, you don't directly call do in background. Instead, you call execute, which then ends up calling, that means do in background gets called on that background thread. If we called run directly, run would still be running on the same thread as on response, which would mean it'd still be running on the main thread. So I want to make sure I'm calling start there, not calling run. Okay. So, given that, let's set up a little bit of code to just test that this is working. My goal is to just see this message on the log, in the log. Okay. So let's go into Tech News app. Okay. So in Tech News app, I need a reference to the repository. So private Tech News repository, repository, and then I'm going to create that repository object in the onCreate method. So mRepository is equal to new Tech News repository and pass in the application object, which is this. Okay. And then I'm immediately going to call mRepository.refresh articles just to test that this is working. Okay. So let's pop up the logcat. I'm going to filter down to Tech News, making sure I'm looking at the right emulator, which I'm using my 7-inch tablet emulator at the moment. So I'm going to hit run. So what I should see in here, I'm filtered down to Tech News. See there it says Tech News repository processing articles. Okay. So that tells me that it actually did get down here to my thread and started it up. Okay. Does everybody see that processing articles method message in your logcat? Okay. So while I'm talking about logging, we might as well add a logging statement here. So I'm going to say log.e log tag, and we're going to say failed to get articles. Okay, so we know anything that went wrong here. At least we can look at the logcat to see that. Okay, so we're going to process those results. All of the work to process the results is going to happen in this background thread. Now, with the async task class, you'll remember that it did allow us to pass data through that execute method. The thread class doesn't accept any parameters into run. So in order to actually pass data to it, I need to use a slightly different tactic. So the data that I want to pass in, I'm actually going to store it as a member variable. So in here, I'm going to add private JSON object. This is going to be the response. And then I need to add a constructor to pass that data in. So public process articles thread. This takes the JSON object. And we're going to save that to the local variable. Okay. So now I've got a little error up here because it's complaining that I haven't passed that response in. So I'm just going to change that. So we pass the response object into the constructor of the thread and then call start. So any data I need to pass in, any data I need to have available to me in the run, I can just pass that in as part of the constructor of the thread. Now, inside run, I want to start doing the work that goes into actually handling that data, actually working with that data. So in there, let's start reading or parsing the JSON. I know I'm going to need a try-catch block because I know anytime I'm working with JSON, there can be errors. So I'm going to catch any errors that should occur, and I will log those errors. So log.e log tag failed to process articles EX. Okay, so anything that does go wrong in here will get logged out to logcat. Great. So the first thing I want to do is extract the parts of the JSON response that I'm interested in. So first I want the feed description. And I'm going to get that from mResponse dot optional string. So say I want the description. And if the description doesn't exist, then I'm just going to give it missing description. So if something were to change, if, for instance, that description property were to be removed, then my application is going to show missing description. Or if I were to have a typo in this name, it's going to show missing description instead of throwing an exception. So there's that, and I also want the items. So JSON array items is equal to mResponse dot get JSON array. the name of that array is items. Okay, so those are the two pieces that I'm interested in extracting from the JSON object. Okay. The next thing I want to do is start updating the live data based on the values therein. So with the feed description, that's fairly simple. I'm going to go to the feed description object that we have. And I have two options. I can either call set value or I can call post value. Okay. Now set value you can only call from the main or the UI thread. That's going to just go directly and set the value. Okay. Post value you can call from either the main thread or the background thread. Here we're in a background thread, so we do have to call post value. Difference being set value is going to go change it immediately. Post value is kind of asynchronously queue it up to be done later on the main thread. But here, because I'm running on the background thread, I need to call post value. Okay, so I'm going to post value, and we're going to post the feed description. Okay, so from there, our UI is actually going to be able to pick up this new feed description value anytime this runs. Once we hook up the UI to actually observe it. Okay, so that's there, and this is why I needed those two things to be mutable live data. If I just define these two variables up here as live data, I would not have been able to access either the post value or the set value methods. Okay, so that's why I need that to be mutable live data. And the other thing is, I also want to return. I'm returning both of these values here as live data because I don't want the UI to post values to it. I only want the repository to be able to post values to it. Okay. So that's where that stands. Okay. So we have the feed description, and then I also need to deal with the articles. So let's create a new list. Actually, I'm going to make this as an array list. Article. This is going to be our articles, and this equals new array list. And I could just leave it here. In reality, I kind of can do a little bit better because I know how many items are in this array. So the array list by default is allocated usually with about 10 items in it, which means it's going to have to resize the array at a different point. So if I tell it how big that array actually is, that will reduce the amount of work it has to do in terms of reallocating the array that underlies the array list. So item count is equal to items dot length. Okay, so that gives me the number of items that are there, and then I'm going to use that item count here. The reason I'm saving it to a variable is because I'm going to end up needing to use this in a few different places. I could just write items.length here, but I'm going to need to reuse that value a few times, so I might as well just save it to a variable. So for int I is equal to 0, I'm going to start looping through the items. I'm going to use item count here, and then plus I. Okay, so for each item that's in this JSON array, I need to create a new article object. So in here, I'm going to say articles dot add new article, and then I'm going to pass in the JSON object. So item dot get JSON object I. And you'll remember if you look at the article class, this is going to work based on the fact that we have this constructor in the article class that's able to take a JSON object and then do the processing with it. So that reduces kind of the amount of code that I have to put here. Otherwise, I would be processing the JSON object and turning it into the relevant properties in that loop here. So Dalton, you're asking about the response listener. All I'm doing is saying start the new thread, create the new thread with the response, and then hit start. So that's the only line of code that I have in the response listener. Okay, so I've posted the feed description. I need to finish up with this. I'm going to say articles dot post value articles. Okay. So that's a good start to my repository. Okay, so this background thread is processing the JSON object and basically just taking out the values of interest and then posting that to those mutable live data objects. Okay, so now those mutable live data objects is what we're going to observe in the UI. And actually, as it turns out, with this change that we've made here, we can extract an awful lot of the code that's currently in our activity as well as the code that's in our service. So both of those classes are going to become really simple now that we've done this work. Okay. Before we go do that, is there any questions on what we've done here? Somebody's using the lawnmower in the next, just outside my window. I don't know if you can hear that. I hope you can't. Yeah, it's definitely loud, and they're definitely going through some branches. I haven't changed anything with the Tech News service yet. Yeah. So red line under that. If you hover over it, Eston, what does it tell you the error is? I'm going to guess more than likely that you don't have that variable defined or declared. It might be, you might be missing a dependency for volley then. All right, so we've created our repository. The feed URL was missing. Yeah. So we've created our repository. We've got somebody mowing their lawn in the background. Yeah, that would do it. Yeah, if you removed it, that would do it. I'm going to now go kind of refactor the main activity as well as refactoring the service to use this. So let's go to main activity first, because that's going to kind of give us the best view into what's going on here. So I want to refactor this to use that repository. One thing I need to do before I can do that, I need to go back to Tech News app because I need a way to get to the repository. So I'm going to remove this line here that's refreshing the articles because that was just for testing. And then I'm going to go in here, I'm going to say public Tech News repository get repository. I'm going to name that without the M. Return M repository. Okay, because I do need that getter in order to be able to actually access the repository in the main activity. Okay, so going back to main activity, now I've got a getter there. I can remove a few different variables. So I don't need the request queue object. I don't need the list of articles anymore. I won't need the mloaded flag. I'm going to remove all those things. So I'm down to just having the adapter and the recycler view and the feed description text views. Okay. So I do want to add a reference to the repository now in exchange for all that. So private Tech News repository, M repository. Okay, so I have a reference to the repository. I'm also going to add a reference to the application. So private Tech News app, M app. Okay, so I'm adding those two variables, M app and M repository. And then down in here, I'm going to give those a value. Yeah, so all of that stuff that we had here previously is going to basically come from the repository. Because the request queue, that's going to be dealt with by the repository. Keeping the list of articles is going to be dealt with the repository. So I won't need either of those things here. So first of all, let's get the application. So mapp is equal to get application. I need to downcast the application to Tech News app. And then I can get the repository from the application. And repository is equal to app.get repository. That way there's only one instance of the repository. If I said new repository here, then there would be more than one copy of the repository object, which would cause problems and mean that I wouldn't get all the benefits from using this repository. A lot of the benefits of using the repository come from only having one copy of it, one instance of it. Okay, so get repository, and then in here, I'm going to remove those lines of code and kind of collapse that. Articles, in terms of that, I do need to get the live data objects. Okay, so live data string. Let's get the feed description from the repository. Get feed description, live data, list of articles. Equals m repository dot get articles. Okay, so I'm going to get both of those two live data objects. In here, I'm going to initialize the adapter with whatever's currently in that live data object. So articles dot get value. So if there already is a list of articles loaded, it's just going to go ahead and start with that list. If there isn't one loaded, it's going to go ahead and start with null. And that's part of why we need to make sure that our adapter can properly handle null values and not throw exceptions when that happens. Because otherwise, this is going to crash immediately because the adapter is going to be getting a null list. Okay. And then once I've got that, I also want to initialize the feed description in the same kind of way. So mFeedDescription dot set text is going to be set to feeddescription dot get value. Okay, so we're going to initialize the adapter to whatever the current value in the articles live data object is, initialize the feed description to whatever's currently in the feed description live data. If I wanted to reorganize these and maybe be a little bit more readable, I might move the feed description over maybe on top of the logic for the adapter. Maybe just reorganize those a little bit. But once I've got those set up, that just sets it with the initial value. That won't make it update whenever the live data objects update. So if I just leave it that way, let's say I go to, well, I can't run it yet. I would just see things still being as null. I wouldn't see any data show up. So I do need to hook up observers for both of those live data objects. So here I'm going to say let's observe the feed description live data. Observe this, and then I need a new observer. Okay, so this is a new observer. It's going to receive a string. So if the feed description changes, then I'm going to say mFeedDescription.setText, and we're going to set it to that new feed description. Okay. If the articles change, so articles.observe this new observer. So if the articles change, then I want to put that new list into the adapter. So set items articles. Okay, so that's all I need to do for my observers. I say if the feed description changes, then update the text view. If the list of articles changes, then put that into the adapter. Okay. You'll probably still have some errors on this file because we need to kind of clean up some other code. So the adapter does need to be notified, but if I look at my setItems method, I'm already doing that in setItems. So setItems is taking care of the notification call there. All right, so let's clean up the rest of the code in this main activity. Okay, so I'm going to go down to first into onStart. I'm going to remove the call to actually refresh the articles on start. Okay, so that's not going to happen anymore. I'm going to go into here. Let's go down to refresh articles. So literally all of the code in refresh articles is going away, and because I've moved all of that really off to my repository. So the only thing I'm going to do in this refresh article methods is tell the repository to refresh the articles. That's it. My refresh articles method here just says tell the repository to refresh the articles, and then my observers will pick up that update. Now, you'll see that there's nothing here initially. But as soon as I hit refresh, there's my data. So there's my feed description, as well as there is my my articles. Okay. Now I may want that list, all of that data to be there initially, without the user having to hit refresh. So basically, what I want to happen is when the application starts, it goes ahead and refreshes that list of articles. So the easiest way for me to do that is to go over to Tech News Repository and just literally at the end of the constructor of the Tech News Repository, call refresh articles here. So if I call refresh articles there, it'll automatically have the list of articles. It'll automatically do that when the application starts. And the reason I'm doing that here instead of the onStart method of the main activity, that means that it doesn't it's not going to go refresh the articles every time the user gets into the application. It'll try to use a cached copy whenever it can. I could do the same thing in the application class. I mean, if I did what I had done earlier, mrepository.refresh articles as the next line, that would literally be the same thing as what I just did here. Having it call refresh articles right here on line 40 would be the exact same thing as calling it right here. No difference. Any questions on rewiring that main activity? Is everybody back at this point where it's now showing the articles in the feed description? So let's, if everybody I guess everybody's at that point. Let's do, I want to do a quick kind of cleanup refactor on the service class. the job service, and then we'll take a break immediately after that. So going to the tech news service, cleanup on here is actually going to be really, really easy. So basically we're going to remove all the code from the service. The service is going to be so simple now because I've moved all that code into the repository. So in the service, the only thing the service really needs to do is cause the repository to refresh. So in there, I can remove the request queue, I can remove the onCreate method, I can remove all of the logic I have here that's referring to that request queue, because all I need to do is tell the repository to refresh the data. That's it. So in here, I need the application. So tech news app. This is going to be app is equal to tech news app dot get application, and then tech news repository is equal to app dot get repository. Now that I've got the repository, I just need to call refresh articles. And I'm actually going to return false to just say, hey, we're done. It is technically running on a background thread. If I wanted to be more specific, I might want to rewire things so that refresh article takes some sort of callback and then use that to mark the job finished. But this at least seemed to work for me, is to just call refresh articles from the onStart job method. Now, one thing this will break, this won't actually be sending notifications the way this is right now. So we'll come back to that after our break and fix the notifications so that they appear again. Okay. So once you get that service refactored, let's go ahead and take a break and come back at 2:15. Hey, welcome back. So, we kind of left off with the job service. We kind of cleared out most of the code that was in the service. So what's really there now is just to refresh articles. So that's really all the service needs to do per se. If we run the application, you will see that there are a few things missing that we had working previously, so we'll need to put those back in. So one of those things is if you hit refresh, there's not a toast being shown anymore, that there is an error. If you jump in, another thing is if you jump into airplane mode, and then hit refresh. See if I can hit refresh. You can just kind of see nothing happens. There's no indication that there actually was an error. So we'd like to put some code in to show those errors, as well as to show the message to say that the list has been refreshed. So we can see that, and we also want to put in notifications again, because those have now been broken, because we're not issuing the appropriate things anymore. Okay, so let's start with the two toasts, getting those back in. The toast for showing that the list has been refreshed, as well as the toast for showing any errors. Let's put those two things back in, and then we'll come back and deal with the notifications. So from the side of dealing with, from the side of showing the toasts, I'm going to kind of take the same tack that I took yesterday with using a broadcast for that. You might think, well, why couldn't I maybe use livedata for some of these error displays or the refresh toast? The problem is livedata is something that kind of sticks around. Then we kind of have to keep the error message sticking around, whereas these messages are more a transient thing. I only care about showing it once and then never again. It really has to do with, I want to show it right at this point of time. So livedata is not really a good fit for this kind of thing. The other upside of using a broadcast is that it can be listened to by things that aren't activities, which is actually kind of important, as you'll see in a minute. So I want to use a local broadcast to deal with that. Okay, so in here, we're going to add another instance variable to store the local broadcast manager. So private local broadcast manager, m broadcast manager, and just by adding that, I think that went ahead and added the dependency. Maybe not, but it seems to have come in just fine. So I have the broadcast manager here, and then I need to create that broadcast manager object in my constructor. So broadcast manager, wrong line. I'm going to put that after the request queue. So broadcast manager is equal to local broadcast manager dot get instance, and pass in the application. Okay, so now I have a broadcast manager that I can use to send out those messages. I do want to add in an action, or actually two actions. So private, actually this should need to be public. Public static final string action refresh, or article, maybe I say feed. Yeah, maybe feed refresh is equal to, let's use the name of the package, which is up to hands-on test 4. And then dot feed underscore refresh. And then I also want to add a constant for errors. So public static final string action feed error. So when it's successfully refreshed, it's going to send out that feed error action. And if it's not successfully refreshed, there's some sort of error with it, we're going to send out that feed underscore error. Okay. So let me add a quick utility method here before refresh articles to make this easier to work with. So public void send broadcast. I'm going to pass in an action. And then in here, let's create an intent. Intent equals new intent. Use the action that's provided. And then we're going to send that broadcast. So m broadcast manager dot send broadcast. So we're going to call that with the appropriate broadcast action for the different places where we need to call it. So in here, so now I got that, I'm going to go into our error listener. So in our error listener, I'm going to call send broadcast action feed error. So if there's any problem there, sending out with getting the actual JSON object, that will throw an error. And then in the catch block down here, I need to do the same thing. So if there's a problem processing the feed, I also want to throw an error on that. Now, if everything goes through successfully, I'm going to send a broadcast with that success message. So action feed refresh. Okay. So if it's successful, it's going to send a broadcast saying that the feed was refreshed. And if it's not successful, it's going to send a broadcast saying that there was an error. So that way I can show the appropriate message back in main activity. And remember, the big reason I need to do this is because A, the repository shouldn't really have access to an activity context, and B, we can't show toasts on a background thread. We do need an activity context for that. Okay. So back to the main activity. I want to go into main activity here. So we need to set up a receiver to respond to both of those broadcasts. So back in here, I need a reference to the remove that dead code. I need a reference to the local broadcast manager, and I need a receiver. So private local broadcast manager and broadcast manager okay, and then I need the receiver. So private broadcast receiver is equal to new broadcast receiver, and then in the on receive I need to find out what the action is. So depending on the action, I'm going to show a different message. So in here, I'll say, well, let's get the action. String action is equal to intent dot get action. And then if that action is refreshed, we'll show the message saying that's been refreshed. And if it's an error, then we'll show an error message. So let's see, what do I have? Yeah, there it is. Okay. So if it is check news repository dot action feed refresh dot equals action, we'll want to display one toast, and otherwise, if it's check news repository dot action feed error equals action, then we'll show a different toast. So here I'm going to say display toast feed refreshed, and maybe here I say failed to retrieve feed from internet, or failed to retrieve feed. So that's my receiver. Okay. Now I've created the receiver, but I haven't actually registered it yet to listen for any of those broadcasts. So I do need to hook that up, and I also need to get an instance of that broadcast manager. So the broadcast manager, I'm going to get in on create, so I can reuse it. So local broadcast manager to get instance this. And in the on start and the on stop, that's where I'm going to register to listen for those actions. So here, let's create a new intent filter. It's equal to new intent filter dot add action check news repository dot action feed refresh dot add action. Actually, I think I may need to do that on more than one line. Yeah, I do need to do that on more than one line. So create the new intent filter dot add action, intent filter dot add action tech news repository dot action feed error. So we want this receiver to get both of those two actions, right? So now we're going to use the broadcast manager, which we just got in on create up here. I'm going to use that to register the receiver. So register receiver and receiver, and pass in the intent filter that we just created. So as long as the application's running, it will be listening for those broadcasts. But when it stops, we want to unregister. So that way the user will only see those toasts as long as they're actively using the app, or specifically as long as they're on main activity. Oh, this needs to be dot unregister receiver, not register receiver. So as we refresh, you'll see it now says feed refreshed at the bottom. if I go into airplane mode, it should tell me that I failed to retrieve the feed. Any questions about those broadcasts? Does everybody, if you have that up and running with the broadcasts, where you're getting both the error and the regular broadcast, please just post ready into the YouTube chat. What error are you getting, Dalton? So it says you're trying to invoke register receiver, this line, on a null object, and that means that your broadcast manager is null. So what you're missing is this line of code up here where you get an instance of the broadcast manager. That's what you'd be getting if you're on crate's not working. Or sorry, if you're getting a null pointer exception. So that hooks up the toasts, and again, the upside there is there's not really no connection between the repository and the UI. The UI doesn't know what the UI is going to do with those two broadcasts, and it doesn't even know if the UI is even listening. So if the UI is listening, it's got that receiver registered, then it's going to show those toasts. But if you're maybe not using the app at the time, it's still going to send out those broadcasts, but there just won't be anybody to receive it. So that's good. So going back to thinking about notifications, we have maybe a few different tactics that we could take to try and resolve that problem now. If we think about the way this used to be, the service used to call the send notification method. But because we've removed all that logic here that was going and using volley directly, that logic is no longer there. So one option I could pursue is I could go to, say, the tech news repository, and maybe at the end here we call send. Maybe in here I call send notification from the repository. I could do that. If I do that, however, I'm kind of binding. I'm creating a connection between the repository and the application, where the repository now knows about notifications. And I really don't want the repository to know about notifications. I just want it to know about data and where to get that data. Okay. And I don't want, and that's also why my method here, refresh articles, it really doesn't know when it's called. It doesn't know that it's being called from a service, and it doesn't need to, because again, The only thing it wants to know about is data. So that logic for sending the notification, I'd like to keep that separate from the repository. Okay. Now, one of the thing that I just did was I added this broadcast that's sent out when we get new articles. Well, I can use that broadcast not just in the activity. I can also listen to that from, well, really any other class in the application. So specifically, I can listen for that broadcast in my application object, which is really where all the rest of the notification logic is. So rather than adding notification logic into the repository, I'm going to use that broadcast to send the notification out from the application object. Okay. So let's go over to the application. The other thing that you might think, well, even without the broadcast, aren't I still getting some sort of event when I post a new value to my live data? Isn't that something that I could observe? Maybe in theory. In practice, this doesn't really work for observing a live data object doesn't actually work for notifications, from the reason that notifications are primarily meant to go out when your application isn't running, when the user isn't in the application, which means that none of those observers would actually get called in the case where the application isn't running. So if I use that won't run. The other thing is that I can only hook up observers from within an activity context. So observers won't really work for me as far as notifications are concerned, but broadcasts do. Broadcasts are still received when the application is in the background. So while I can't hook up an observer to the live data, I can listen to this broadcast. Okay, so I'm going to go to the Tech News app, and we're going to hook up a broadcast receiver to listen for when there's new data. Okay, so in here, I'm going to add private local broadcast manager and broadcast manager. I'm going to add a receiver, private broadcast receiver, and receiver is equal to new broadcast receiver. And then inside of the onReceive method, I need to again get the action. String action is equal to intent dot get action. And then I'm going to say if the action is tech news repository dot refresh. So if it's the refresh action, then I do care about it. Then I want to potentially show the notification. Now, with that action, I don't get the article, the new article, so I do need to go retrieve that. Retrieving that's not too hard, but I need to go into the repository to get that. So let's do that. Let's call this new article is equal to, actually, I take that back. I need a list of articles. So list article, because I do have to do some error checking. So list articles is equal to repository.getArticles dot get value. Okay, so that's going to give me the current articles that we have. Okay, current list of articles that we have. I'm going to say if that article, if that list of articles is not null, because it could be null. This could be at the beginning of the app when we haven't loaded the articles yet. If it's not null and there is at least one article, then we're going to try and show notification using that top article in the list. So here I'm going to say send notification articles dot get 0. So that's what my receiver is going to do. If it gets a refresh action, then we're going to grab the list of articles and try to send a notification based on that first article in the list. You'll see both of these lines are grayed out because I'm not using the broadcast manager. I'm not using a receiver yet. So similarly to how I just hook up things in the main activity, we need to get the broadcast manager, and then we also need to register the receiver. So let's go down to the onCreate method. I'm going to do both of those things. So in here, broadcast manager is equal to local broadcast manager dot get instance this, and then I'm going to register a receiver for that. Now I think I don't want to register the receiver until all that's done. So broadcast manager dot register receiver. Receiver, new intent filter, and I'm only listening for just that one action. So tech news repository dot action feed refresh. I only care about when it's refreshed. I don't care about errors as far as the application is concerned. So that's my broadcast receiver is hooked up. I got the broadcast manager, and then I registered a receiver to it. I guess I could probably do both of those lines maybe together, at least for this case. Maybe keep that more cohesive. Okay, so one thing I do want to do to test this, I've actually put some code in previously to prevent it from going out the first time. So I'm going to comment that out. And here I need to put in if mlist article is not equal to null, because it was depending on that. There. So it's not null and it's equal. There we go. And it failed because I am in airplane mode. There we go. So we can see there's the notification that popped up. If I run it again, I should see that appear. There we go. So basically, I'm hooking up to the local broadcast for both the main activity as well as for the application to listen to that. So any source that needs to know about new data can just listen for that broadcast. So yeah, with unregistering it. So when we're talking about an activity, we want to make sure that we register and unregister all of our receivers. With the application object, because the application object is only ever created and not really destroyed, there's no on destroy kind of for an application. That means the application shut down. I actually don't need to do any sort of unregistration in terms of the application. If I was doing this in an activity, then I would need to, or other classes, but because I'm doing this in the application object just doesn't ever unregister receivers. But that's okay because it only ever registers it once. Any questions? I hope this gives you some insight into kind of the value of the repository pattern, and even outside of necessarily having a database. This really means that all the data is kind of held in one place. And with this here, one of the things you may notice if you actually try to turn the device on its side, things just kind of, I do need to turn auto rotate on. There we go. If you turn it on its side, you'll notice it's very quick about returning to where it was, but you'll also notice that I never implemented on save instance state. I didn't need to, because it's just rehooking up to the repository when the new, reconnecting to the repository when the new activity is created. So main activity just hooks up to the repository again, gets the values, and it's off to the races. So I actually, for this particular application at least, I don't really get any benefit out of using a view model per se, because I actually get all of those benefits from just using a repository. So I have kind of 2 items left on my list of things to do today. We've set this up to use the repository. We've hooked that up into the services, the notifications, the UI, but I'd like to get this into a place where if you start the app without a network connection, it can go and pull up the articles that were previously kind of saved, previously pulled down. So that can potentially reduce the number of times that we have to actually go out to the internet to get the list of articles. And that's useful for a lot of applications to be able to cache that data rather than having to retrieve it every time. And there's a few things along the way that I think this will show us, a few things that we can learn from that process. So there's 2 pieces that I'd like to cache, okay, of the data that we're displaying. The first part of the data that we're showing is this feed description. And the second part of the data that I'm showing is the actual list of articles. So I'd like to cache both of those things. The articles, I'm definitely going to cache in a room database. That's going to be the best way to do that. But the feed description, I really have a few options. So with the feed description, I could save it to a room database. That would mean creating another entity just to store that string. And that would be fine. But that's a little bit more code than I really need to write for this, especially for kind of a simple just, hey, I need a source string. I could say, well, maybe I just write it directly to a text file, right? That's a perfectly valid option too. One of the things we talked about though in chapter 9, remember, or lesson 9, was the shared preference object, which the shared preference object is really great for storing strings, which is really what we have here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use shared preference to store that string there. So that'll give you an idea of how to store maybe little bits of data like that you need to store around from the internet when there's, maybe you don't need a full table to do those kind of things. So I'm going to integrate that into my repository as well. So let's go into Tech News repository. The upside of the stuff that we're about to do is that most of the rest of the application won't even know that that caching is happening. It'll just work with whether it's from the database or whether it's from the network. So I want to introduce the shared preferences. So I'm going to add in a member variable for it. So private shared preferences is m preferences. I need a few constants just to set that up. So the first constant I need to define is private static final. Is going to be the name of the preference file. So this would be string so I'm going to name that with the name of my package. So I'm going to call that edu.rankin.prsmith hot4. So that's the name of my preference file. And then I need a name for the actual preference. So private static final string pref feed description. So I'm going to name that preference feed underscore description. Okay, so that's the name of the file that it'll be stored in, and that's the name of the key. Okay, so let's go into here, into the constructor. I need to get that shared preference object. So m shared preference, m preferences is equal to app.get shared preference, and I need the name of the file, so pref file name, and I need to pass in the mode, which is mode private. Okay, and then to load the value, so at least we're making sure that we initialize the feed description. I'm going to grab that here. So string feed description is equal to m preferences Get string. I'm going to use that key that I just created. So preference feed description. And if it's not there yet, I'm just going to put in loading because it should be there shortly. Now to help with testing, and actually because I don't necessarily need it anymore right now, I'm going to go ahead and comment out refresh articles here. As it turns out, the service is already automatically starting when the app starts, so it's already going to refresh the articles when the application starts. So I don't necessarily need to do it twice. So I'm going to load the feed description here, and then I'm going to pre-populate my live data object with that feed description. What am I missing? I've got to have a typo. Cannot infer type arguments. Oh, I know why. Okay, so I need to do one thing real quick. It's saying that it can't infer it, so I could force it to be, I could explicitly tell it that it needs to be a string, but it says it can't find it. Well, that's interesting. Cannot infer type argument type T. T is a type variable. Well, what am I missing? Get string. That should be happy. Mutable live data. Build a clean project. So let me try one thing. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure why it's working. It worked in the example that I did before starting here, but that's not working now. But I know that I had the Java 8 features turned on, which I haven't done here. So let me right click on the application. Open module settings. Let's set this to source compatibility 1.8, target compatibility 1.8. So that should turn on the Java 8 features, which I suspect might be the problem here. Maybe not. Mutable live data. Let's go to definition. That's interesting. Yeah, that was the thing I was trying to import earlier, and it didn't actually show up. As a dependency. So that's where I'm kind of wondering what might have gone on. So it might be that I need to include apply to given types. Required no arguments. Oh, because whatever version it's bringing in doesn't have a constructor. That's interesting. Okay. So whatever version it brought in doesn't have a constructor. That's what's happening. So let me update the dependencies. That's definitely the problem then. So I need the live data object. So I need to add some dependencies for the lifecycle components. So lifecycle version 220, and I really just need live data for this. So I should just need that dependency, and I actually probably can just hard code that in there here. Let's see if that is happy. Yeah. So that's what it was. It's just missing a Gradle dependency. It is just missing a dependency on the live data object. How it was picking up the live data objects without depending on the live data dependency, I don't even know. But there must have been some version that's included maybe with appcompat or one of those other libraries I'm already bringing in. Yeah, it's already in there. Okay. Okay, so that'll initialize the feed description. Okay. So if I have a previously saved feed description, that should result in it being displayed when the application runs, even if there's no network connectivity. But I do need to go into my task here, and I need to save it to that shared preferences file. Otherwise, it won't be there for me to read. So in here, let's add a little bit of logic to save that feed description. So immediately after I post the value, let's save the description to the preference file. And so I need an editor, shared preferences editor is equal to mpreferences.edit. I need to save the value and then change the value and then save it back. So editor dot put string, and I'm going to put in the pref feed description. Feed description. So we'll save that value, and then we'll do editor dot apply, which will actually cause it to be saved to the file. Okay. So that way, when I run it, when it has a network connection, it will go ahead and save that to the preference file. So there we've run it with that code. I'm going to turn on airplane mode and run it again. And what we'll see is it's able to now pull that feed description from the preference file rather than having to get it from the network in this case. Even though it can't connect to network, and you can see it still failed to retrieve feed, it's still able to get that from the preference file. Any questions there on caching some data to the preference file? I don't want to do the same thing with articles simply because it's because of the amount of data, because I'm dealing with a list of objects, which could easily get quite big. Shared preference is really only designed for small primitive values, not objects or a list of objects. Yeah, so the articles I'm going to save off to local DB. Again, I could save this feed description. I could also save it to a DB, but that would mean adding a whole table just to save one string, which is kind of overkill. Now, if I had more than one feed, if maybe I had like the tech news section and the sports section and the entertainment section, then it would definitely be worth my while to add maybe a topics or feeds table to the database. But because I'm only displaying this one feed, this is good enough. And you will have cases like that where you only need to save small primitive values sometimes. How are people doing? Because the next thing I'd like to do is add the room database, but I know that's going to take a little bit of time. So the question is it better to take a break at this point, or should we press on and do the room database work now? Yeah, that's the last thing. So the last thing will be to cache the articles. Cool. So we'll do that next part. Add room. I need to add some dependencies. So let's go back to our Gradle and let's add those in. I'm going to add in the room components. And I'll share those on Discord. So 2.2.5 is the latest version. I need the room runtime. I need the annotation processor. And I also want that test implementation dependency. Okay, once you get those dependencies in there, make sure you hit sync. And then we need to go into the data folder and start adding some annotations. So first we'll start with the entity class, the article class. So we need to add some annotations to there. So the first thing we need to do is add the entity annotation to the top to mark that this is an entity. And then I need to mark what the primary key is. So here I've already added in the ID from that JSON feed. I already know that's unique, so I'm going to use that as my primary key. So my primary key is going to be that ID, and that cannot be null. Okay. That's really, I think, all the annotations I need for my entity class. In this case, remember I can add the column info annotation if I need to specify, for instance, that the name of the column is going to be different than the name of the variable, or if it's going to have a different data type, here it's going to automatically figure out that they need to be stored as text because they're strings. Or if I needed to change the collation, then I would also do that. Here I'm not going to really mess with anything that needs the collation, so that's enough. Okay. So I'm going to add in the DAO next. So in here I'm going to say new Java class article DAO. Okay, I need to mark that with the DAO annotation. And that needs a few methods. So first of all, I want an insert method to be able to insert articles into the database. So here I'm going to do void insert. Oh, yes, this does need to be an interface. Correct. So we're going to insert articles. I'm going to let the user insert as many articles at once as they want to. Okay. Then I also need a method to delete all articles. That'll allow me to clear the database out. And finally, I need a method to get all the articles. So this is going to be live data list article. Get all articles. Okay, so those are the three methods that I need to have in here. Okay, so now I do need to add some annotations to both of these two methods. I need to specify what SQL that it's going to use for that. So here I'm going to specify the query annotation, and that SQL is just going to be delete from article, because that's the name of my table. Okay, so delete everything from the article table. And here my SQL is going to be a select statement. So select star. Select star from article. I'm not going to order it because I want my articles to come back in the same order that I saved them. Okay, which is going to preserve their order that I got them from the web service, because the web service is already returning them to me ordered by their publish date. So as long as I don't reorder those should all come back in that same order. Okay, so that's my article DAO. It just has those three methods. Insert, I need to be able to insert articles. I need to be able to delete articles, and then I need to be able to get all of the articles. And we'll notice that this is returning a live data object. Now, technically this doesn't have to be a live data object here. I could also set this up with it's just returning a list of articles. So that would kind of set things up in a different way. But I want to show you how to use the mediator live data, which is going to allow us to kind of switch between the offline database and the online network list. So that's what that's for. That's why I'm doing it that way. So let's add our database now. So I'm going to add a new Java class. This is going to be the Tech News database. If the word article is showing up in red, okay, so if this is showing up in red, that probably means you did your annotation a little bit different. So when I created my entity annotation, notice that I didn't specify a table name, okay? Because I didn't specify a table name, the name of the table is article. But if you, on the other hand, said table name is equal to blah, then the name of the table is going to be blah, and this is going to show up red like that. So the reason that that works for me as article is because I've left it with that default name of article for the table name. So in the Tech News database class, that needs to extend room database. And this one's going to be like super simple. Really not much logic I need to add into here. So I need to add a getter for the DAO, public abstract. Oh, and I do need to mark this class abstract. So it's an abstract class and with an abstract getter. That's going to get the article DAO. Okay. And then I just need a method to build it. So public static Tech News database build. And this needs an application object to get started. And in there I want to say return room dot build database, or database builder. I need to pass in the application, the class, so Tech News database dot class, and then this needs a name, so I'm going to call it Tech News.db. That's going to be the name of our database file. And then underneath that, I want to specify that their fallback to destructive migration. So if anything changes with our schema, just throw the data away. And that's perfectly fine for this application because the user's not putting any of their data into this database. And this is just as basically an offline storage location. So we don't really care about losing the data. Again, if I did care about losing the data, then I would need to specify migrations. But for this purpose, that's it. One last piece I need to do before I leave here is to add the database annotation to the top of the class. So at database, I need to specify what entities go into this database for schema purposes. So entities is equal to article.class, and I need to specify that the version number is 1. Okay, so that's my entire database class. I don't need any callbacks because I'm not going to pre-populate this database with any data. If the user starts with no network connection, then they just don't have any articles to look at. So that's fine for my purposes. If I was going to pre-populate some data in there, just remember you'd need to implement the callbacks like we did with the Word database example. So that's my Tech News database. I need to construct an instance of that, and I want that instance to be owned by the application. So I'm going to go to the application and add a place to store it. So in here, before the Tech News repository, I'm going to add private Tech News database, database. So a member variable for it, and then in onCreate, I'm going to create a new database using the method that we just made. So Tech News database dot build, pass in the application, and then now that I've got the database, I'll need to pass it into my repository so my repository can use it. We haven't made those changes yet to the repository, so this is still going to be red. That's okay. We'll just add that right now. So go into Tech News repository. We're going to take in that property. So here, tech object tech news database DB. I want to go ahead and save that. So I'm going to add a variable for that. Tech news database, database, and save it in the constructor. Okay. So now in theory, our repository now has access to that database object. And can use it to do operations on the database. So once we've got that hooked up, we've kind of got two things remaining. So first of all, we need to save the data to the database. And then the second thing is we need to be able to retrieve the data from that database when the application starts, should there be no network connectivity. Okay, so in order to save the data, I'm going to go back to our task down here, right? So towards the end, we've sent the broadcast. I'm going to do it after that. So here I'm going to say, well, let's save that data. Let's save those articles that we've got. So before I save the data, I need to, let's get the DAO first. So the article DAO equals m database dot get article DAO. With the DAO, I need to first delete all the articles that are there. So we're starting with an empty database. And then I'm going to insert all of the articles that we got. So here I'm going to add a for each loop. So for each article, and articles. Let's insert a article. And I might want to add a logging statement there to know that that occurred. Log.I, log tag, articles saved. So I can see that that's actually working in logcat. Now, if you do try to run this, more than likely you're going to get an error about the schema file. Maybe not. That it hasn't saved the schema. Let's check real quick. Oh, because I need to turn airplane mode off so I can actually get data. There we go. So there it actually did go through. For me, which is interesting. If you do get an error about the schema, what you'll want to do is go into your build.gradle, and there's some code you need to add to specify where the schema file should be saved. So in here, it is. Let me just copy that in. So that's the section that we want there to specify that the schema should be saved into the schemas folder. I'm going to paste that into Discord so that everybody has a copy of that. So if you do get an error when you run it, that at least related to the schema, that should fix any issues that it gives you with complaining that the schema file can't be saved. Does everybody have it running successfully, loading a list of articles and writing articles saved to the logcat? If yours is just saying loading, you need to turn off airplane mode when you run it, so it can actually load the data from the network right now. So what we've implemented so far is the logic to save it to the database. We haven't implemented the logic to actually load it from the database. You might need to hit the refresh button also, depending on where you're at in the code. All right, so we've got live data there. If I run it in airplane mode now, which is saved to the database, I'm going to put into airplane mode. Let us restart the application. You're going to see that it's still not loading the articles. Yeah. So we still need to put in the logic to retrieve it from the database when there isn't a network connection. So in the repository, okay, this did the logic of saving it. I need to go back up to here. Okay, so I'm in tech news repository. I've got the constructor. So here's the deal. Right now I only have one live data object, which represents the list of articles. And that's really coming from the network. Now, what I need to add right here next is another live data, but that one's going to be coming from the database. So before I do that, I'm going to actually rename this live data object here. So you want to make sure you right-click refactor as we do this. So right-click refactor, rename. That will make sure that it gets changed everywhere in the file. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to be M network articles. Okay, because these are the articles that are pulled from the network. I'm also going to add another member variable for the database. So private live data. Notice that this one's not mutable. This is going to be a live data list of articles. And this is going to be the M database articles. Now, my goal is I want to be able to merge these two things into basically one source. I want the UI to still only see one live data object. I don't want it to see a network live data and a database live data. I want it to just think that there's just one live data. So to work around that, there's an object called mediator live data, which is also a subclass of live data. It allows you to kind of combine multiple sources of live data together into basically one live data object. So in here I've got network articles, I've got database articles. I'm going to add another live data. I'm going to call it merged articles. And this is going to be a type of mediator live data, still list of articles. So M merged articles. So I've got network articles, database articles, and merged articles. So what I want to happen is that if there is articles from the network, then those are the newest articles. Okay, but if I don't have any articles from the network, then I'm going to fall back and use the database articles. Okay, that's the way I'm going to approach this. So in here we need to get the database articles. So M database articles is equal to M database dot get articles DAO dot get all articles. Okay, so we've got the network articles and we've got the database articles. And then I need to create this merged articles object. Okay, so merged articles is equal to new mediator live data. Okay, so that creates the object, and then I need to start adding sources. Okay, so the first source I'm going to add to my merged articles is the database articles. So M merged articles dot add source. I'm going to add the M database articles. Now, when I add that, you can see that I also have to add an observer. So with the live data source, I also need to add this observer. So new observer. Okay. Now, what this observer does is when M database articles changes, it determines how should I update merged articles. Okay. So specifically, I only want to update merged articles if there are no network articles or we haven't gotten any articles from the network. So in here, first thing I want to do, I'm going to say if m network articles dot get value. Well, if it is null, okay, if it is null, then we're going to use the database articles. So if there are no network articles, then we're going to use the database articles. So here I'm going to say m merged articles dot set value, and we're going to set it to articles. So once the database articles are loaded, we're going to check, hey, are there network articles? Or if there's any changes to the database articles, we'll check, are there network articles? If not, then the merged becomes the database articles. Okay. Now I need to add a second source, which is going to be the network articles dot add source m network articles, and this also needs an observer. Okay, so when we get network articles, as long as that's not null, as long as the articles that we didn't get, that we got, are not null, then we're going to update the merged articles to be the network articles. Now I may want to write a logging statement in here for both of these things. So log.i to kind of see what's going on. So log.i here, log tag. So here I'm going to say that it was articles loaded from database. And here I'm going to, and the other side I'm going to say that articles were loaded from the network. Okay, so I have two different messages. I'm going to be able to see that in logcat to see which way it went. Now I need to do one more change before I actually test this. Namely that I've created this merged articles object, but I haven't actually passed it to the UI. So I need to go to get articles and change that from returning the network articles to return the merged articles. So now when I run it, we'll see that it's able to load those articles from the database. So here it says articles loaded from database. You can see them appearing here. If I turn off turn off airplane mode, we can see now that it's also loaded from the network. So if I run the application, you'll actually see both of those things happen. So you see articles loaded from the database initially, and then it comes back and says articles loaded from the network. So one slight performance tweak that I can make to this, once we've loaded articles from the network, we're not ever going to load articles again from the database. So we can actually remove that source once we've loaded them from the network. So m merged articles dot remove source. Remove the database articles. And that way it won't be receiving events every time this observer won't be called every time every time that we get new articles from the network at that point. So kind of the point of this exercise is it gives you a way to kind of merge two data sources together. So you can merge the network articles, the live data with a cached copy of it, kind of into the same live data object. So we prefer, if there is articles from, if we have gotten it from the network, we'll use that. Otherwise, we'll use the old copy from the database. So, any issues? Does everybody all get that working correctly? So are really the mutable data and the mediator, the mutable live data and the mediator live data. Those are both things that we hadn't really covered in the theory portion, and aren't really, unfortunately, covered by your labs either. But I think that this, especially mixing it with Volley, is really going to point you in the right direction, be very helpful as you're working on your final projects. Because more than likely, and this is kind of the expectation, is that most of your data will be pulled from online sources. So this gives you a way to kind of bring them in and hide the details of where the data is actually coming from in this repository, rather than having the entire application know about the details of where you're getting your data. So tomorrow should just be a lab day. I don't plan to give any sort of theory, whatnot tomorrow. That should be entirely a lab day. You should be able to finish up. You'll want to work on the 10.1B labs if you haven't finished that yet. But the big thing to make sure you do tomorrow is to turn in your second draft of the project proposal. That's the thing that's due tomorrow. Due date on the 10.1B, that's on Wednesday next week, so you have a few days to work with that. But the big thing you want to get going on is the final project. If you haven't completed the reading assignments on Perusal, please make sure you do. I've been working through those, putting comments on the people that have done that. I still got some reading to kind of review and put comments on. The written test, I think, is queued up for Monday. And I'll get you the next hands-on test next week. but I don't know if I'll have that on Monday. That might be Tuesday. Expect that the next hands-on test will cover the room database, and I'll expect some live data on there. I think that as far as the next test is concerned, I won't add volley or some of the stuff that we've looked at today for network resources, just to kind of keep it a little bit simple. I might put settings on there. I haven't decided that yet, but definitely expect the room database to be on the next hands-on test, as well as live data. So expect a little bit of CRUD. That's probably the direction that I'm going to go, is probably just CRUD on one table. Similar to what we've done with the what you do in the 10.1 labs, which is CRUD on a single table. All right. So I think that's a wrap for at least this session. So I'll be on Discord for the rest of the day, should you have any questions with this. But I hope this kind of gave you some more light to what you can do with the architecture components that's maybe beyond just working with databases, that you can integrate network resources and APIs as well. Okay.